My name is Gary Orfield, and I'm pleased to welcome you to a forum on Martha Minow's fascinating new book, Partners Not Rivals, Privatization and the Public Good. Tonight we're going to have a presentation of some of the basic ideas of the book, followed by a series of reactions to them. And we're going to try to preserve plenty of time for you to ask hard questions about these issues. The country's involved in another of its continuing transformations of redefining the spheres of what's public and what's private and how they intersect and how they interact and what are the boundaries. And we are in the middle of really portentous and important changes on many dimensions. And it's a situation in which confusion is easy, stereotypes are common, and wisdom rare. And the reason that we have Martha Minow here, and brought her over from the law school, is that she is characterized by subtle and complex thinking about serious issues. She is professor of law here at Harvard Law School, author of Making All the Difference, Inclusion, Exclusion in American Law, another book, Not Only for Myself, Identity, Politics, and the Law, and still another, Between Vengeance and Forgiveness, Facing History After Genocide and Mass Violence. For those of us here in the ed school, it's particularly interesting that she's always been a bridge between our two schools and a treasure for both, I think, in many respects. And that she is also a person who's not only studying the law and thinking about legal principles and how they apply to complex realities, but she's also engaged in the third year of a collaboration with the United States Department of Education about creating access to education for students with disabilities. So she's dealing with the complexities not just of ideas but also of hard realities. So without saying anything more, let me bring up Martha Minow.
Well, it's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. I was a student here a little over 25 years ago, and in fact was just recalling having a statistics course in this room. And it actually was about 25 years ago that I first heard the idea of school vouchers. There was an experiment initiating school vouchers in Alum Rock, California. And people here at the ed school, my fellow students and faculty members all said, "Isn't that a wacko idea?" Well, something happened over the last 25 years. So not only is it not so wacko, it is policy in several communities. And I wanted to understand what happened to make this idea move from wacko to something that is actually, if not at the mainstream, at least being seriously considered in communities around the country. When the Supreme Court rejected a challenge to the voucher scheme in Cleveland, Ohio, 7 months ago, it basically gave a green light to communities. You want to experiment with school vouchers, taking publicly raised dollars and putting them in the form of vouchers, allowing parents to select from among schools, including private for-profit schools and private religious schools. Go to it. Now, there are two big deals represented by that decision. The first is that government dollars now can be used to pay for religious education, and that religious education can include religious instruction. The second is that education is now potentially viewed as something appropriate for marketplace transactions, competition, private choice, private consumption. And the suppliers of education should be plural. They should include for-profit companies, not-for-profit, religious, as well as what the voucher advocates like to call the government monopoly. Now, a funny thing happened on the way to my inquiry into school vouchers. I started reading the newspaper and magazines, and I started to realize, oh my goodness, it's not just schools. There's something similar set of experiments and debates going on in a lot of other fields. Most notably, initially to me, was the welfare reform, the statute that President Clinton signed it, ending welfare as we know it, included in it a provision that was not much debated, not much discussed, called charitable choice, that allows the states to actually take the funds from the federal government and make them available to private, including religious organizations, to deliver the services that are provided for under the statute. Increasingly, this use of vouchers and private contracts is being used in many areas that had been governmental or public at least for the last 40, 50 years. Just as an example, prisons, dispute resolution. And I started to think that I should take seriously Yogi Berra's comment, you can learn a lot by watching. And I decided I better start watching. And what I found was that there's a set of trends blurring the boundaries between public and private, between secular and religious, and between profit and nonprofit. And I think some of it's good and some of it's bad, but most of all, I think we should talk about it. One of my favorite cartoons from the New Yorker shows some people in a living room with those furry monsters behind them saying, well, do you think we should talk about it? I think we should talk about it. So the book explores the trends that blur these borders. And just as an example, I'm sure you're all familiar with cause-related marketing, where companies encourage the purchase of their consumer items by saying $5 from your expenditure will be sent to a charity when you buy your $50 Calphalon pan. That's a kind of blurring of public and private in the sense that it's really exploring the degree to which the consumer wants to be doing good while also privately consuming. Probably a better, more dramatic example, though, is the introduction of for-profit companies that are receiving government contracts to run prisons, to run welfare-to-work training programs, to run schools. Lockheed Martin. Lockheed Martin is one of the major providers now of welfare services in the country. Religious organizations are serving as sites for dispensing counseling and benefits funded with public aid. Now, as I try to step back and explain these trends, as well as try to explore why they're not much arousing public discussion, I find three basic explanations. The first is there is a widespread disappointment with government. It's interesting to me that the School of Government, our two commentators may want to say something about this, has been engaged in a serious examination, self-examination. What explains the loss of faith in government? Well, whatever explains it, it's there. There's a loss of faith in government. And that trend may be somewhat reversed after 9/11. Suddenly we want to have government-provided checkers at the airports. It turned out those were all subcontracted services by private airlines. But it's still, I think, a general trend. And most interestingly, on this first point, disappointment with government, there's a very fascinating coalition of odd bedfellows. Because the leading figures that have really characterized this debate include, on the one hand, people who believe strongly in the free market and want to bring the discipline of the free market, efficiency and competition, to areas like welfare services and schooling. And on the other hand, the advocates of privatization and the critics of government provision include people who are religious or who believe that religious providers do a better job, and do so because they think that religious communities better cultivate a sense of moral obligation, better cultivate relationships, and better use the transformative potential of spiritual belief and practice. A second explanation, though, is I think that there is a change in the self-perception of religious minorities in America. I think many religious minority members feel safer in America than they used to and are less worried about the blurring of the border between government and religion. I'm Jewish. I think this is true for many people in the Jewish community. And so on the voucher debate, while it's much divided, the Jewish community, there are many prominent figures in the Jewish community who are in favor of school vouchers. This would not have been conceivable 25 years ago. I think it's true also for many Catholics who feel that it's safer now to be participating in the public realm, as well as there's a religious obligation to be doing so. And it's also true for many evangelical Christians who accepted for a while the privatization of the religious world that really occurred, to be frank, because of a big fight over whether evolution could be taught in the public schools. And they retreated to a private realm. But many sociologists have been documenting how that period of retreat is over, and it's exemplified by the growing presence of religious vocabulary in the White House, in the Department of Justice, and elsewhere. Third, I think that there is a strategic set of planning steps engaged in by particular groups with conservative ideologies, the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, and others, supported by conservative foundations, explicitly to press for privatization as a policy initiative. Parental choice in schools, deregulation of workplace safety, selling national parks, these have all been, if you read their position papers, these have all been the topics that they've been pushing for about 20 years. Now, I don't think it's all bad, don't get me wrong, but I think it's helpful to try to understand, well, what's happened to shape the public debate? And my concerns, most fundamentally, are how can we protect public values, public values that have taken a long time to fight for and define, which surely are open for redefinition, but should be done so in public, not by giving over the tasks to private groups. And what do I mean? I mean the norms against discrimination on the basis of race, on the basis of gender, on the basis of religion, on the basis of sexual orientation. I mean due process, the right to be heard before you're denied a public benefit, the right to be heard before you're locked in some confined setting in a prison. I also think that it's very important to pay attention to how indifferent people are to these changes, so that when the Homeland Security's bill was adopted, there's really very little discussion about how, in essence, this privatized a whole set of employees who no longer are going to be governed by the usual rules that apply to government employees. Not much talk about that. But at the same time, I'm concerned about protecting private spheres, private universities. Private universities should not be dictated to by the government, even when they receive government funding, when it comes to matters of free speech or when it comes to matter of recruiting on campus by groups like the military who violate the university's own anti-discrimination policies. I'm also worried about protecting houses of worship from regulation by the government. I think that there really is a jeopardy if there's too close a connection between houses of worship and the government, where the government is really interested in its own purposes and may undermine the autonomy, self-determination, and the integrity of the religious activity. And finally, I'm worried about losing a sense of public commitment to the sheer level of need in this country. Need expressed not only economically, but surely there, where the most disadvantaged are at risk of becoming further disadvantaged, if that's imaginable, in a world in which the savvy choosers are the ones who get their kids into the better schools, that that's what it turns on. I worry about how the accretion of individual decisions by cities and towns and states, one by one, may each look like reasonable decisions to privatize garbage collection, privatize security, privatize this, privatize that, but at some day we maybe wake up and there's no more public. That's what I worry about. No more deliberative debate, no more public review. When I turn back from this inquiry into the broader trends to look at school vouchers, I did predict in the book, although it was published before the Supreme Court's decision, that the court would uphold the voucher plan. Given the trends in the court and actually given my own analysis, I think it's actually correct as a matter of constitutional law that religious schools should not be excluded from a program that is available to any other private provider. To say other private schools can receive the vouchers, but not religious schools, is to treat the religious schools in a disadvantaged way, which I think actually does violate the Constitution. But having said that doesn't mean that I'm done with it. I think that just because there's a right to do something doesn't mean it's the right thing to do, and I remain critical of and skeptical of the use of vouchers in the school context. I'm worried about what will happen unless there remains careful public monitoring, particularly to ensure that there are common standards of anti-discrimination. I'm worried that religious schools may say, we won't accept you if you're not a member of the religion. We won't accept you if your parents aren't actively involved, because that's part of our religious program. I'm worried about the way in which any lack of public oversight may, in fact, contribute to an inability to fulfill the ideal of competition. Because if there isn't a requirement that the schools have to use the same measures of accountability, testing, evaluation, how are parents supposed to compare among the schools? And yet if you deregulate, there may in fact not be such a requirement. Different schools may use different tests, different assessment methods, and then how are the parents supposed to compare? So I actually think that school vouchers are constitutional. The Supreme Court has agreed with me, but I think they're a bad idea. When I turn to the area of welfare reform, I almost have the opposite view. I think that as a predictive matter, they may well be found unconstitutional, but I actually think they're much more promising as a policy initiative. I think they're at risk of being found unconstitutional because they would engage the government in the very difficult, if not impossible, task of figuring out what's a legitimate religion, or what's a religion worth getting this validation that they will in fact run the alcohol substance abuse program. Which kinds of groups will be recognized as appropriate providers of welfare to work transition. And if they are drawing those distinctions, they're going to be in the business of preferring some religions over others, which is precisely what our Constitution says they must not do. And it's not only that the Constitution says it. We know what happens in countries that actually engage in that kind of government support of some religions and not others. And it's not pretty, and it actually is very dangerous. At the same time, I think there's something very intriguing and promising about the possibility of tapping into the resources, the communities, the commitment that many religious institutions have towards addressing the needs of the poor, addressing the self-esteem questions for people who've been out of work for a long time, many of whom feel isolated and cut off from community. And I actually think there's some very promising initiatives already underway. Maybe the big difference in my view here is that schools, I think, perform fundamentally a public function. And preparing people for citizenship in a polity, I think, remains a public function. And I'm worried about privatizing and pluralizing it. In a way, I'm not so worried in the human services area, where, to be frank, I don't think the government's done such a good job. So, essentially, if we do permit experiments in either of these realms, I'm convinced that we still need to retain an important role for the public defining the standards against which these experiments should be evaluated, the public demanding monitoring and collection of information, comparable information, allowing private parties as well as the polity together to make evaluations about what works and doesn't work, and preserving the public space for debate about whether we're going in the right direction or not. So 5 more minutes? 3. Perfect. So I have a lot of worries. You know, Lily Tomlin says she's worried that the person who thought up Muzak may be thinking up something else. I have those kinds of worries. You know, she also says she worries that, you know, if olive oil comes from olives, where does baby oil come from? You know, I have these worries also. And so I'm worried even to go one more step and say, here's what are the public values against which I think we should evaluate privatization. But I'll go ahead and do so with the caveat that the fundamental public value that I really feel most strongly about is democracy. So the one thing I know for sure is that the statement of public values cannot begin and end with me sitting alone in my office in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's got to be something that's publicly debated, deliberated, and argued. The one thing I know for sure is we should do it. We should talk about it. We need to talk about it. Having said that, yeah, here's my set. I think that public values that deserve protection and preservation, even with pluralization, competition, are individual freedom of belief and expression, government neutrality towards religion, neither to benefit nor burden any one religion or religion compared to non-religion, the rule of law, meaning fair hearings, opportunities to be heard, opportunities to enforce existing rights, even if the manager is private. The Edison schools will not share their data. We don't know exactly what they are doing. This is a problem if they're running public schools. I also think freedom from discrimination, as I've already said, is crucial. Freedom from inferior treatment on the basis of race, national origin, language, gender, disability, religion, sexual orientation. And the government fundamentally should not be in the business of subsidizing that discrimination, should not pay organizations that engage in that discriminatory activity to do it, because it violates public norms. I think that there, at the same time, must be a continuing public commitment to provide for basic human needs for people who cannot do it on their own. And that doesn't mean necessarily direct governmental aid. It does mean governmental support for the kind of system, a plural system, that enables public and private actors to work as partners in that enterprise. And finally, pluralism. Pluralism, which the market economists called competition, which the sociologists talk about instead as respecting diversity. And pluralism in a religious concept really means that there might be more than one way to truth and the insight that we're all searching for. Finally, a lot of what I'm talking about is demonstrated by the landmark decision of 1973, the Court of Appeals in a case called Wilder versus Bernstein. Wilder versus Bernstein grew from the New York City foster care system, which, like most foster care systems, relied on public religious providers for foster care services and adoption services. Indeed, the very idea of a public agency in this business is a recent phenomenon. Historically, it was the action of private religious groups and other private groups that created the idea of caring for children whose parents can't care for themselves. But this lawsuit was brought because the best agencies that had contracts with the city of New York were Catholic and Jewish. And those agencies had policies that preferred matching by religion children with the religion of the foster parents or the adoptive parents, which meant that they preferred Catholic and Jewish kids, which meant that they dispreferred by a vast proportion children of color who were Protestant. The result was children of color were as likely to be in institutional care for 2 to 3 times as long as the other children. So this lawsuit said this has got to violate something. It's got to violate something, equal protection, something, and the court said, you're right, this violates something in a big way. That's the scenario we're setting up right now with privatization. That's what worries me. A wonderful journalist, Nina Bernstein, followed up what happened in the case in her book called The Lost Children of Wilder. She found at the same time that the kind of dilemmas that the case itself revealed, she found behind the case is the other part of our dilemma. Government provision of social services has been a failure in the foster care business. So not only was Shirley Wilder the subject of that lawsuit, subject to repeated placements and a very sad life, her son ended up in the same foster care system, and her grandson ended up in the same foster care system with nothing good in their lives, not even each other. They only reconnected because the journalist brought them together. How do we provide for basic human needs? That's got to be as compelling a public concern as respecting freedom of religion, as respecting freedom against discrimination. That's the dilemma that I've addressed in my book, and I hope that our panelists will answer the problem.
Our next speaker is Mary Jo Bane, who is the Thornton Bradshaw Professor of Public Policy and Management at the Kennedy School of Government, and was also at one time years ago a student here at the Ed School, and has always maintained a friendly relationship. She was also serving as Assistant Secretary of Health and Human Services under President Clinton, and is one of the few major federal bureaucrats in our lifetime who's resigned in conscience over an unconscionable act of the welfare reform policy proposal of the Clinton administration. She's also in the rest of her life very involved in community and in movements, particularly to bring churches and communities together for social action in the greater Boston area. Mary Jo?
I suppose in the interest of truth in advertising, I should admit that I got my doctorate here at the Ed School 30 years ago, and my master's more than that, and that during my time at the Ed School, Martha, which was before your time, I actually worked with Christopher Jenks and a group of other people who produced the report on school vouchers that led to the wacko Alum Rock experiment to which you referred at the beginning. Actually, it's interesting. I haven't gone back and read that report. I never go back and read what I wrote that many years ago. But the report that led to the Alum Rock experiment tried to think through the issue of vouchers and came up with a scheme which was actually very regulated and tried to put in place a number of safeguards against the things that people were worried about. The interesting thing about that report was that it went almost nowhere, i.e. Alum Rock was the only little teeny place that was willing to do it. So it's interesting. I think I actually still believe what we wrote in that report, though I suppose I would have to read it in order to make that statement. Martha, in her book, in the introduction to her book, said that she was going to deal in the book with two questions. One is the question of what combination of governmental and private actions can accountably meet basic human needs while promoting freedom and pluralism. And then the second question that she dealt with in the book is how can religious resources strengthen society without endangering tolerance and democracy? I want to mainly speak to the second question, but just make one comment on the first, which is it is true. I teach at the Kennedy School, and I teach management, and I teach many international students, and we talk about the various ways that one can structure government and private sector organizations and nonprofits and so on to deliver public goods. And it is clearly true that as we think about the question of providing for the common good and delivering public goods, that there are lots of new models. And a lot of experimentation is going on with contracting and privatization and partnership and competition within public sector agencies and so on. And my guess is that the kind of innovation and experimentation that's going on literally all over the world is going to generate some positive models, as well as, I think it has, also generated some negative models. But I guess I would just, first of all, support Martha's statement that, this is happening. It's happening all over the world. And I think we're going to learn a lot, and I hope that we will be able to do that. But let me speak to the issue of religious resources and society. And I've been working actually with both Martha and Mark as part of a seminar over the last couple of years thinking about religious resources and civil society. And as we think about those resources, we've tried to look at data, we've tried to do some thinking about what it is that religious organizations contribute to our public life. And although the focus over the last couple of years has been on what they contribute in a narrow sense, i.e. what they might contribute to the delivery of social services, it seems very clear that religious organizations are the source of about half the social capital in the United States. They are the major gathering places for people outside of their workplaces, whether we like them or not, and I do. Whether we like them or not, they are there. They are a fact. 70% of Americans claim membership in one of them. It's a big deal. And they are perhaps the primary place in which social capital is created. They are also a place, obviously, where many, many people learn their values, are socialized into a set of ways of thinking about their obligations and about citizenship. They are settings for moral dialogue. They provide, interestingly, opportunities for political participation and some of the skills for political participation. I think as we look at that, we say, geez, there's a lot of these organizations. They do a lot. What are the questions that we want to raise as we think about the policy issues? And obviously, Martha has raised many of them. We need to worry about whether in their socialization, in their moral dialogues, in their social capital, they are creating intolerance and division rather than something else. Whether the kind of social capital that they create tends to go across groups rather than inside. Whether they provide an excuse for government to be relieved of its responsibility. I would propose that these are empirical questions and that we can actually look at these organizations as they work. We can look at what people say. We can look at what people believe. And at least as I have looked at the data over the last couple of years, I find myself being somewhat less worried about the tension points than I might be if I was only thinking about this conceptually. One of my favorite stories is a study of evangelicals, which was done by Christian Smith a couple of years ago and published in a book called Christian America. Well, now there's enough to kind of raise your little hackles, isn't it? And he did interviews with evangelicals, and he asked them, do you think America's a Christian country? Yes, America's a Christian country. Do you think America should be governed by Christian principles? Yes, America should be governed by Christian principles. What does that mean to you? It means that everybody has the opportunity to worship as they wish. Well, now isn't that interesting? Another of my favorite stories is a study which was done by a doctoral student in sociology of the pro-life movement, and very involved pro-life activists. And, he spent some time with them. He's a brave person. Spent some time with them, talked to them a lot, asked a series of questions. Do you believe that abortion is absolutely wrong? Yes, absolutely wrong. God tells me it is absolutely wrong. I know it is absolutely wrong. How should we go about dealing with this issue? Through the democratic principles of our Constitution. Because if we hold to those principles, we will come to the right conclusion. And I think what you see in a lot of this, and those are just two examples, but I don't think they are outliers, though other people may wish to challenge that. I think what you see in a lot of the empirical data is a sense that people do indeed have strong religious commitments. They bring them into the public sector, but that democracy has socialized religion here as much as religion has socialized democracy. And so I get slightly less twitchy about all that. Let me just make a couple of controversial statements about vouchers, and then turn it over to Mark so that we can, put some of these issues on the table. Martha made the argument that she thinks that school vouchers are constitutional, but probably bad policy. The Supreme Court seems to agree with her on constitutionality. We will now all have the opportunity to think about whether they are good in terms of policy. I would just ask you to think about the fact that when the GI Bill was passed back after World War II, and when Pell Grants were enacted, whenever that was, kind of later on as building on the GI Bill, there really weren't any questions about whether they could be used at religious colleges and universities. Of course they could. Nor was there any controversy over whether Medicaid, also a voucher, by the way, a voucher for health care, whether that could be used at religious hospitals or religious health care institutions. Well, of course they could. And I suspect that most of us, probably especially those of us who have used our Pell Grants at religious colleges, though I was pre-Pell Grant myself, would probably still agree with that. Well, why is it then that we think that elementary and secondary school is so different? Well, one answer would be, well, because it needs to be a public function and it needs to be done well by the public system. Look at the schools in Cleveland and in Boston and in pretty much any other place. Is that really a good argument for why we should keep out some innovation, some competition, and so on? And I guess on this one, I also think this is an empirical question, and that we ought to be willing to do some really substantial tests of what happens when we introduce different ways of organizing schooling into places where the schools have demonstrably failed. We may find that it gets even worse, but we may not.
Our next speaker is Mark Moore, who's the Guggenheim Professor of Criminal Justice and the Director of the Hauser Center on Nonprofit Organizations, which is a university-wide research program based at the Kennedy School. And he's also the author of Creating Public Value, Strategic Management in Government.
Thank you, Gary. I'm a public administration and political guy, all right? So I'm going to come at this from a slightly different angle than my colleagues. And in particular, I'm going to set aside some of the important issues about that Martha and Mary Jo both take seriously and I take seriously in another capacity, which has to do with secularization of religion. I'm going to come at this sort of from a slightly different angle. And I think that Mary Jo gives us points to the right ambition that Martha said that she had, which was to figure out the combination and public and private activities that would be necessary to meet basic human needs. And so in some sense, you imagine that there is a well-defined set of basic human needs, and the only interesting institutional design question is how to structure the institutional relationships so that we make the maximum contribution to the meeting of those basic human needs. Now, cast that way, notice that the discussion almost always becomes a question of the efficiency and effectiveness of alternative institutional means for the achievement of an already defined goal, right? But you could imagine that one of the most interesting and important public-private boundaries that we negotiate all the time is precisely the conversation that we have over the question of what constitutes a basic human need that is sufficiently basic and sufficiently important that we will take a collective responsibility for trying to be sure that it is met at a certain level in every case for every individual in the society, right? Which is actually a political decision about which things are going to be like that, right? As opposed to which things are going to be left in the private sector to some extent, where the both the level of that good and the distribution is going to be determined by people making their individual choices about how to spend their own resources that are available to them after we've made the decision about how much is left to them, after we've decided how much we need to take to accomplish our important public goals. So I want you to remember that what's implicit in this formulation in some sense is the idea that we already know what ought to be a public purpose, where we understand a public purpose to be the provision of services through the apparatus, through at least the fundraising and the authoritative powers of the government to try to produce, right? And then the interesting question is there is a choice to be made about that that has to be decided. And to be interesting, I'm not sure whether we should think of politics as being in the private or in the public sector. It's an interesting thing to think about in some sense because in many respects it's a quintessentially private activity, right? You can do it or engage in it or not. You can do what you want in the political sphere. All of that makes it sound like it's private. You can express your own interest there if you wish to, right? And yet it's about a public object and about the important question of how we're going to use the coercive powers of the state to raise money and to regulate our conduct to achieve purposes that we collectively agree on through a representative process are important to achieve. So first thing is to understand that one of the most interesting private-public boundaries to look at is precisely the place where we negotiate what is going to be private and what is going to be public, and that is in the world of politics. But let's suppose for a minute that we've gotten into a world in which we've made some kind of collective judgment that purpose A or basic needs A, B, and C are to be met by the government. It's at that stage that in some sense a public administrative hat turns out to be a little bit helpful, because the question then turns out to be, well, what would be an efficient and effective way of accomplishing those agreed upon public purposes? We're not going to argue anymore about whether this should or should not be a public purpose. The only interesting question is how to get the job done. And at that stage, what we've heard is an argument that there's a great virtue in privatization. But my colleague Jack Donahue, let me give you three quite different definitions of privatization, all of which tend to get blurred together. But I don't think they should be because I think they have quite different implications for how we think about the problem. The first meaning of privatization is essentially stopping produce it through paid government employees called bureaucrats and instead contracting out the provision of the service to either a for-profit or a non-profit organization, right? So let's call that the contracting out idea of privatization. Let's have fewer bureaucrats and more contracts and grants that support nonprofit and for-profit organizations. And we can have a big argument with one another about how to arrange that and whether it would work and a variety of different things like that. But in the end, I can't see in principle why we should be terribly anxious about whether the good that we're trying to produce is produced by a government bureaucrat, a for-profit entity, or a nonprofit entity, if we can be relatively confident that we have specified in either the grant or the contract the full set of public values that we would like to see realized through this activity, right? Now, that's a pretty big if, because it often turns out to be hard for us to specify in the contract the full range of public values that we would like to see realized through the operation, right? And even if we did that, it might turn out to be hard to construct an administrative apparatus that would allow us to reliably achieve that goal. But in principle, I don't care if the product is produced by a bureaucrat or by a for-profit person or a non-profit person, as long as I'm able to specify the contract, right? If I can't specify the contract, then I have to get a little bit nervous because I have to be worried that in the slop that's created by my failure to specify the contract, people will either import their own ideas about what's publicly valuable or will use the opportunity to take some of the resources that were available for achieving the public purpose and spending it on themselves, right? And you could imagine that the tendency to do the first, namely substitute their own ideas about what would be publicly valuable, might be the pathology of the bureaucrat and the nonprofit person, right? And the tendency to want to take some of the money for your own benefit might be the pathology of the for-profit entity. But at the outset, I can see pathologies in all the kinds of institutions as we try to structure them for the efficient and effective production of agreed-upon purposes. That's contracting out and privatization. The idea of a voucher, it seems to me, is a remarkably different idea, all right? And it looks similar in the sense that we've agreed that something's a public purpose. We've raised public money to pay for that, all right? But the difference now is that instead of trying to regulate the production of that through a contract that contains within it all the information that specifies what the public value is to be produced, we, at that stage, give up our collective right to define what constitutes a public purpose, and we turn it over to the individual to say, you can pick now whatever you want, all right, in this area. And so in that particular moment, a collective definition of what the public value is that justified sort of the raising of the money has suddenly been turned over to an individual to decide how they're going to use the government money to accomplish the purpose that the government had in mind. Now, typically with a voucher program, there are strings attached, and some of them are attached on the demand side because we say you can't spend the school voucher on medical care, or you can't spend the medical care voucher on school care, because we made a collective decision that what we wanted to supply was education, all right? And so you, as an individual consumer, don't have the right to take that money and then buy something else with it, right? We want you to buy education, right? And that's one form of string. But the other form of string could be is that we will establish a certain number of accredited suppliers, right? And you can only a certain number of people who do certain kinds of things are appropriate suppliers. And in that moment, of course, we've reduced some of the competitive pressures and some of the incentives for innovation that we thought were associated with a pure private market system, but we've protected ourselves against the idea that some bizarre thing might be supplied that wasn't what we as the collective had in mind at the outset anyway, all right? So what's interesting then about that situation is that the question then turns out to be is how much are we going to try to constrain the choices of the individual consumers, and coming to the awful recognition that it turns out that we that set up the program actually had purposes for this that are independent of the desires of the individuals who are the ostensible beneficiaries of it, right? It turns out that our goal isn't just to do what parents and kids think would be good and valuable for them. Our goal is to ask kids and parents to do the things that are good and valuable for them and to engage in a set of experiences that would justify the use of public expenditures, which is to learn how to be a productive citizen in the future, right, or something like that, right? So in the voucher system, we have this awkward combination between public raising of funds, public purposes, which then get turned over to an individual to decide exactly how it is that they're going to spend it. Just as a side comment on the voucher system, one of the things that's always worried me about vouchers is the long-run effect of the following type. Imagine two different conversations we have. One is, do we want to educate our children, and do we want to have it be in a high-quality school or not? That's conversation number one. Conversation number two is, we ran this voucher system last year, and the voucher system last year paid $2,000 to every kid. Now, do we want that number to go up or down next year? I think that's a very different political conversation, and the instinct would want to go down, all right? The last meaning of the word privatization is to remove a domain from public ownership and control entirely, all right? That is to say, the public washes its hands of this area. Whatever is going to be produced, both the level and distribution of it, is going to be produced by individuals deciding how much of their own resources they would like to spend for this. And I think in some ways what Martha holds out is that in the specter of the last two things, the privatization that's associated with vouchers and the privatization that's associated with removing things entirely from the collective sphere of government, is essentially a loss of a capacity within the society as a whole to be able to carry on the conversation about what it is that we would like to achieve together. Not just the best means for achieving what it is that we're going to achieve together, but what are, in the end, the purposes that we think are so important that we're prepared to tax and regulate ourselves to produce as a matter of collective commitment. And I agree with Martha that that's the principal choice. And I suspect that the real reason that we have this enthusiasm about privatization and vouchers and all that sort of stuff is that the political world has come to the conclusion that there is no such thing as an effective and competent collective institution. That politics is incapable of forming a considered we that can have aspirations and desires. All it can do is produce sordid, corrupt agreements. And that government institutions are incapable of producing an efficient and effective and fair delivery of services. All they can be relied upon to do is to aggrandize their bureaucrats. And I think that it has been a systematic political campaign over the last 30 years to persuade people of both of those points. So that if we can't have a politics that can form a collective agreement about what we should do, and if we can't trust a collective institution called the government to accomplish those goals, all right, then what we have reminded ourselves in America once again is it's best not to have too much of a collective life. Right? And it's best to live as much as we can individual lives, because that's the direction in which great happiness and great liberty can be found. And the less we have to leave to our collective institutions and our collective independence, the better. Right? And I believe that is a misrepresentation both of what is in human interest over the long run. So, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Martha, for raising the cry.
I'm going to add a couple of other issues, and then we'll open the floor for discussion. And what we're going to want from you are questions, not speeches, and hard, short questions. I'd like to just raise the proposition that really follows on some of Mark's comments, that the tremendous focus we're putting on privatization debates is a diversion, a very serious diversion, and is intended to take our focus away from issues of any kind of serious social and economic change or of the tremendous and deepening inequalities in our society, and focus them on relatively trivial issues, and suggest that by changing the administrative structure of certain programs or offering a small number of choices to a few people, somehow we will change deeply structured issues like the quality of the Cleveland public schools, for example, which is abominable. But offering a few hundred vouchers, which is what went to the United States Supreme Court, changes it very little. In fact, basically subsidizes mostly a few families that already have their kids in Catholic schools, which is a similar result to what we see in Indianapolis and some other places. Looking at metropolitan Milwaukee and seeing that we've gone into presidential campaigns debating over whether 300 or 400 kids did a little better or a little worse in a few voucher schools in Milwaukee, and not noting the fact that Milwaukee is one of the most intensely segregated and unequal metropolitan areas in the country, and that nobody intends to do anything about crossing those lines, redistributing any income, seriously permitting the kids in the bad public schools to go to any of the good public schools. That all those issues are taken off the floor. We also find when we move into this discussion of privatization, the issues of race and class somehow disappear, and there's some assumptions made that are absurd, that people have equal information, that they have equal access to knowing what the choices are, that we don't have to provide information that goes to our many millions of people who don't speak English, for example, in making these choices. We don't have to provide for language minority kids in the schools that they're supposed to have choices. We don't even have to provide them a way to get to school. Just by having some kinds of choices, that things will be better. I'm just going to introduce a couple of bits of data from recent studies of the Civil Rights Project. We looked at all the private schools in the United States and found that they are as segregated as the public schools, even though they have much smaller proportions of minority students. And we found that the largest system, which I deeply regretted, since it's the church that I belong to, the Catholic public schools, the Catholic parochial schools, are the most segregated of all. Yet people are suggesting that there's both a capacity and that there's something fundamentally different about these systems. If they aren't, it's really deeply diversionary. If there's neither capacity nor a substantial difference, and so forth. Brookings Institution recently published a study of charter schools in the United States that suggested that the children did a little bit worse, controlling for some background characteristics in our thousands of charter schools that we've created on average, than children who went to similar public schools. We have recently computed the segregation measures for the charter schools and found that they're even higher than the public schools across the country. Markets aren't necessarily good for poor people. Anybody who wants to look at how markets work for poor people, look at what kind of grocery stores there are in ghettos and barrios compared to those that are in the middle-class communities. If vouchers were a great solution, we'd have really good medical care in our inner cities now. We've had the Medicaid as a voucher now for some long time. And it shows us that if we don't deal with provision, if we don't deal with quality, if we don't deal with location, if we don't deal with the level of the voucher and many other issues, we can come out with a terrible set of emergency room only medical opportunities. At the same time, we're pumping many billions of dollars into vouchers. Systems that have one single payers, government funded health care, probably deliver this much more effectively than we have done through this incredibly expensive voucher system that we operate. So what I'm saying is if we have a society that's coming apart on racial and class terms, that has deep, incredible inequalities, the fact that we have a political movement that attacks government, says we can't solve anything in the public, and then says somehow that the markets are magic, is oversimplifying issues in a very dangerous and diversionary way and leading us away from focusing on problems we're ultimately going to have to confront. Now, as a person who works in a private university, who contributes to many private organizations, who's active member of a church, so forth, of course, I'm not completely consistent about these things, but it seems to me the discussion that we're having, particularly when it comes to issues like education, is a very misleading discussion. The reason the public schools are different than colleges is that school is mandatory through the school age, and they are our most universalistic institution. And they played very, very important roles in the development and cohesion of this country. And we do not have any idea of whether those roles can be or will be played adequately by these alternate systems. And we certainly can't generalize from the tiny experiments we've had so far. And some of the international comparisons suggest to us that they may produce even greater polarization than what we already have in our private schools, in our public school systems. Anyway, these are some issues that I think we need to keep in mind as we go into this discussion. So the floor is open for your hard questions. Yes? You want to identify yourself?
Reg McCain, Harvard Institute for Women in Retirement.
Yes.
And I loved Professor Orfield's denunciation of privatization. So I'm going to ask, since we lack I gather we lack a strongly pro-privatization member of the panel, and since I haven't recovered from Martha's opening comment that some of these things, some aspects of privatization are bad, some are good, I'd like her to give some concrete examples of privatization goods.
Well, here's one example. After criticizing the foster care system, I think it's only fair that I should identify, I think, a real strength that private adoption agencies have introduced to the adoption field. So publicly managed adoptions in this country have historically had very tightly regulated rules that match families by race and require the adoptive family to be married and heterosexual. And as a result, it meant that lots of people who were willing to adopt kids couldn't, and lots of kids who needed homes couldn't get them. There was a market in babies. And private adoption agencies developed. Some states forbid them, but many states don't. And one of the things that happened is that the private agencies have actually now challenged the power of those public agencies and made it possible for lots of kids to get into homes that otherwise couldn't. Now, there's an example that has then led some public agencies to contract out with private agencies to figure out a better way to meet the needs. And rather than having kids, babies spend their first 2 or 3 years in institutions, actually quickly get into a private home. Sometimes private entities can act more quickly, more deftly, more flexibly than public bureaucracies. And sometimes they can identify niches, competitive niches, that the public entity won't. And that's an example that I've been impressed by.
Very good. Go ahead.
I'm Richard Sobel, and I had a conversation this afternoon with some people about state action. This had to do with health care, the dropping of consent from the HHS medical records regulations. But I'm interested in the mixture of public and private. To what extent does paying for something with public money mean that public norms, anti-discrimination, or political participation should be involved? And to what extent is the privatization of public monies essentially anti-democratic? E.E. Schatzschneider, a wonderful political scientist, compares the socialization and privatization of conflict. Socialization, democracy, public interest, privatization, private interest, special interest. So I'm interested in how much democratization should there be of the public sector, how much should the public sector affect the private.
So state action is a technical term that lawyers use to refer to when there is an activity engaged in. Does it trigger the legal requirements, for example, under the 14th Amendment Due Process Clause or Equal Protection Clause? Because it turns out, unlike in some other countries, in this country, our Constitution only guarantees people rights as against the government, not against the phone company. You may have had that experience. And so what that means is that unless the actor, the agency, the institution is characterized as a state actor, there is no violation of equal protection. There is no violation of due process. So I was really intrigued with Mark's discussion of the contracting out process and saying, well, one solution to the fear that you bypass all of these restrictions is that you build it into the contract. The reason that Mark ends up there is that our courts have said you do not convert a private actor into a public actor simply by giving them a contract. So right now, in this country, if a government decides that it will deliver prison care or it will deliver foster care or it will deliver any other service through a private contract with a private agency, unless it's specified in the contract that that agency has to follow public norms, under the law, it's not a state actor. The Supreme Court ruled that a school, a private school here in Massachusetts that received 97 to 99% of its budget from the government was a private actor not obliged to follow public rules. So it doesn't matter how much money it gets from the government. That worries me. That worries me a lot. And I think that there are sometimes deliberate and sometimes unknowing decisions by governments to get out of public obligations by contracting out. So that worries me a lot. Your last comments about the maybe reciprocal effect that public and private may have and how democracy and social activity may influence each other is a big one. I don't know I can fully answer it. But I think about that a lot, no doubt because I am a lawyer, in the context of dispute resolution. So our court system is the place for enforcing law. It's not a great place to spend time, by the way. You don't want to spend time in the courtroom. And so not by accident, we've developed a lot of alternatives. Alternative dispute resolution is what we call it, ADR, some of which are actually linked to the courts. You know, you walk into the court and lo and behold, you're sent out and told go mediate your dispute. I think a lot of that's a really good thing because I think going to court is like going to war, and I'm not for that. Having said that, increasingly in this country, many people don't even know that they've lost their right to go to court because they sign an employment agreement, for example, that says any dispute you may have with your employer, you cannot go to court about, even though if you didn't sign this contract, you could go to court. Instead, any dispute you have will be resolved by an arbitrator who's selected by the employer. That's what's going on in a form of privatization. Other countries, by the way, have a very different view that say rights actually should run even into the private sector, and that's something we should explore.
Mary Jo?
I actually wanted to give two other examples of privatization, going back to the previous question. One is the food stamp program. Before we had the food stamp program, we distributed peanut butter and milk to people because we made a collective decision that that was the right way to
cheese, too.
Pardon me? And cheese, too. Yes, that's right, Gary. From Wisconsin, they know about cheese. Because that was what we decided people ought to be eating. What we did with the food stamp program was we gave people vouchers for food, which says that you can buy pretty much anything you want. And I would argue that that was probably a good thing to have done. And I just want to use that example to kind of anchor the area in which vouchers are almost certainly the right thing to do. You could even go further and say cash would be even better. But in that area, it seems to me we probably agree that vouchers are the right thing to do. So where do we, where do we go with that? The other example I want to give is garbage collection. Most cities actually have privatized their garbage collection. You may or may not have noticed. But most cities have found that this is an arena where they can specify the contract, they can get bids, and it turns out they can get the garbage collected cheaper and in many ways better than when the public employees did it. Again, I just want to and it's relatively non-controversial now. Some cities let public organizations compete for garbage collection, which I think is a splendid idea. Sometimes they win, which is even better. But again, I think it's an interesting to kind of anchor, kind of what kinds of things are like garbage collection and what kinds of things are things that we can't really specify those contracts.
Well, just my tail end comment is exactly on that. It turns out we're very, very lucky to have the option of vouchers or privatization where we know what we want to accomplish. The problem is when we don't know what we want to accomplish, it's not a very good device. And schooling is a fascinating case because we think we know what we want to accomplish until we start talking about it. Right. And then it turns out we actually have very different and competing views about what we want to accomplish. And that's why I'm not sure it's the best example to try out vouchers right now in this country.
I have a question to the panel and to Professor Orfield, I think, in particular. I'm wondering if the idea of choice in education is inherently a bad thing, or is it the way that it's being applied and administered is the problem with the idea of choice?
Yeah. I think there's all kinds of different choices. I've thought of at least 1 million different definitions. It depends on where you're offered choice among, what schools, under what conditions, whether the school gets to choose or the individual gets to choose the school, whether it's within a school district or across school district boundary lines, whether it's public and private or just public, whether there are genuine educational options that are actually honestly explained, whether good information is provided to all the people, whether a way to get to the school is provided, and so forth. And I think if you think of that list and you think of 5 or 6 conditions, you can think of a choice system that's really wonderful, where you have options to go to much better schools, where you have transportation, where you have good information, where the parents are welcome and given what they need, where there's a fair selection system that does not involve the school discriminating in any way, where people who would have preferential access to information and so forth aren't given preference in the admissions process. Really good magnet schools are like that. There are some charter schools that are like that. But on the other extreme, there are choice systems where your choice is meaningless, like a lot of the choices under the No Child Left Behind Act, where children in failing schools are allowed to transfer, but they're only allowed to transfer within a school district. Most of the spaces that are available are in other failing schools. Good transportation isn't provided. The parents don't have information. There is no net gain from it, so on and so forth. And you know that choices of that sort are going to be, the advantageous choices are going to be few and far between. The system's going to be very complex and expensive, and the people who get the good choices are going to be people who know how that system works. So it depends completely on many, many conditions of the choice, whether it's a good and equitable idea or whether it produces increased polarization. And what kind of rules you get depends on what the courts and what the political systems do. During the days of good desegregation plans, we got good rules in a number of cities. Right now, there's virtually no rules on many of these issues, and the ones that do exist are being abandoned in more and more cities, often under court orders saying that you can't take, for example, the intentional desegregation into account in running a choice system. So under bad conditions, choice really stratifies. Under good conditions, it can create opportunity. And it's all about what those conditions are. And the politics of these situations are that the people who have advantage and have political access want the systems to be run in a way which gives them advantages. And that's the logical direction the political system moves over time, unless it's corrected. And that's where having the collapse of the federal judicial system as a balance for equity has been a very critical loss.
I agree very much with Gary said, but I want to say one thing. We have school choice in this country. If you have money, you have school choice. You pick where you live.
If you have money and you're white.
Well, you have money and you're white, but increasingly there are suburbs that specialize for non-white people too, if you have the money.
But
the problem is, quite seriously, that we don't have school choice for people who don't have resources. And the way that these innovative programs are being designed is, as you said before, Gary, they're symbolic, they're superficial offerings. Oh, well, yes, you can get your kid out of the failing school, but to where? To what other school? It seems to me that the choice is not the problem. The choice is the inequity. But then I'd say one more thing, and here I want to talk about the rhetoric. If we use school choice as the motor for improving the quality of instruction around the country, then we're saying, essentially, schooling is a private consumption item. And if we treat schools as a goodie that people are entitled to for their own children, then who's going to care about schooling anyone else's children? The big problem in this country is that we don't think that all the children are all of our children. And the rhetoric of choice isn't going to help us on that.
Professor Minow, you mentioned that with school vouchers that there needs to be a way to monitor the quality of education in a standardized way. And in terms of how that works with people using education vouchers for religious schools, how do you think that will play out in terms of excessive entanglement and even at the other private schools that aren't religious, how can the government create a policy to accomplish that?
Well, it's a very good question. Entanglement is a technical term that the courts have developed to assess when government involvement with religious organizations violates the Establishment Clause. And it used to be an important concern of the courts. It's not anymore. The courts don't care about entanglement. So we can talk about entanglement as something that we care about. It's not going to be a problem, honestly, for the courts. I think that it is a problem from the vantage point of the religious schools. How much do they want to turn over their books? How much do they want to turn over their activities? How much do they want to say, come on in and tell us what we're doing? Are we doing it right or wrong? Now, I think that's one thing that's always available to a religious school is to say, we don't want your money. We're not going to take it. And in that sense, their rights aren't being invaded. But I think there really is jeopardy for many, particularly urban religious schools that are hurting for money. And the Catholic Church, unfortunately, is going to be in need of money in a lot of places in the country and going to be looking for some government support here.
And they're really eager to turn over their books.
Indeed. So, but standing back and just saying as a policy matter, what do I think could be useful here? There's a lot of emphasis now on standardized testing and trying to have the same test used in public and private schools and charter schools and magnet schools. And on one hand, I'm for that because at the moment it's very hard to compare these schools because they use different tests, so who knows who's doing what. On the other hand, I'm really worried that the emphasis on how do we evaluate schools will entirely be consumed by these single measure tests. And anybody who knows anything about the quality of schooling knows it's not well calculated by the student's performance on standardized tests. It's one measure. If it's accompanied with many others, it could be very rich. So what I'm really worried about is that initial calls for comparable information across schools is going to dumb down the process of evaluating schools.
Could I just make one quick comment on that? Because if you think about the things that has been, various ideas that have been nominated as important purposes of public schools, right? Gary suggested that there was an important purpose of a public school, which was in some sense the acculturation of a citizenry, right? I suspect that if you had articulated that 20 years ago in these halls, you would have been thrown out, right? And would have been sort of viewed as this is the oppressive view of education as a instrument of cultural oppression of one kind or another. But nonetheless, let's accept that as one plausibly important idea about what a purpose of a public educational system would be. We now have another idea about what the purpose of a public educational system is, which is to essentially produce students that can read and write. All right, and then we could ask the question, well, is that important? Is it important because it's important to those of us who are paying for the education, hoping to get from students who can read and write resourceful citizens and economic producers in the society, or is it also something that's important to each of the individuals who chooses to participate in the school, right? And we could imagine that, Gary reminds us, that public schools are required, right, and have been for a long time. And you could imagine that insofar as that's true, the collective has said we have an interest in making sure that everybody reaches certain standards of education, and that's true regardless of whether the parents or the kids decide they want that or not. They have to do it, right? And if they don't, they get thrown in jail for truancy or whatever, or parental abuse and neglect, all right? So we've got one idea, which is it's good for acculturation. It's good for producing students who can read and write. And the whole idea of a voucher and a market, though, is that it produces something that the individual students and their parents like. Okay? And so then the interesting question is what do we think they like? Do we think they like being acculturated by the public schools? Do we think they like learning to read and write? Or do we think they like something different than that? And if it turns out that they like something different than that, are we prepared to pay for that with public money?
One of the things that I think is interesting in Martha's book and in some of the comments, I just put it back to you, Martha. You talk about assessment, and Mark talks about contractual commitments to things. But once you create major private institutions, they become political actors in their own right and have power and have money to contribute to campaigns, and they have publicity drives and so on and so forth. So the actual regulation and actual enforcement of these contracts is very problematic. And how do you move?
The same is true of a public workforce, though, too, here. I mean, basically every time you start running money through a system, you create a group of people who have an interest in continuing running that money through the system, and it doesn't much matter whether it's a private contractor that forms an association or a school teachers that form a union. Pretty soon there turns out to be effective political representation for the continuation of those processes. So I don't think that divides the world very cleanly between the public and the private.
But we do get good data. Or we get lots of data from, say, public schools, and if you try to get it from private school systems, you don't get it.
Well, you could make that a condition.
You could make that a condition of participating.
You make that a
that doesn't. It's not a big issue.
That one doesn't bother me.
States require schools like Edison to make their data public?
No.
What do you mean, their data on what? In other words,
But they're not their books, not their economic books. They do require them to have performance evaluation, absolutely, about the students.
Not their economics.
But not their economics.
Well, I'm not so sure that's true, Martha. You could certainly ask them.
It's one reason that Edison lost a bunch of schools in Philadelphia is that they refused to make their books public.
Their books, but they make a proposal.
Oh,
right?
of course.
And then the contract can be audited.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
And that contract can be audited, and that's a whole
Yes.
different thing than whether their books can be audited.
No, that is
We
right.
have a question here.
I have
Go right ahead, and then we'll come to you.
I have kind of two questions. One, I always think of the privatization movement as simply the ultimate consumer movement. Every time you listen to television or watch a radio, listen, and you see a new drug, and you see the person telling you to tell your doctor that this is what you want, that's exactly what's happening in schools. Parents are coming in with the latest methodology saying this is what I want for my kid, and now I want this other school. And the notice and the information they have is horrendous. They don't know. So that's number one. It's only been touched upon a little bit. But this is kind of the ultimate consumer society, isn't it? And what we want is not, unfortunately, the public good anymore. We want what we want.
Well, you'll have the last question. That was a very good comment. Last question up here.
Well, I'd just be tempted to say one quick thing on it. I noticed that when you use the word consumerism, two different things might come to mind, all right? One of them is this kind of faddishness and the not really preferring things that have long-term, lasting, enduring value or something like that, and that's the burden of your comment. But another way to think about consumerism is that it is the celebration of an individual choice over a collective choice, right? And so one of the ways to understand what's going on in the country is essentially a rejection of any capacity to make collective choices in favor of individual choices for things, all right? And that, I think, in many ways is an equally dangerous thing to be attending to, as well as sort of the idea that the consumer tastes are a little bit faddish.
Well, I also heard in your comment a distrust of people and treating them as people who simply hear the latest buzz and that's what they go for. And I think that a lot of that's true. But we have here the founder of the Right Question Project, which is a wonderful project that actually invites parents to come and learn about how to ask questions about their children's education. And guess what? They can get up to speed pretty quickly and start to hold institutions accountable. So the question is, how much do we trust people, and who do we trust, and do we trust a democracy? And I worry that if we simply go the market language, you're right, but if we actually use choice and pluralism as a method for building the capacity of people to hold institutions accountable, we'll be much more successful than having managers decide for everybody.
Well, and I think there is a question of what the alternative is. I mean, if you think about it, what's the alternative to parents making the choices for their children? I mean, it isn't a big democratic debate in the community. It's a group of experts making those choices, and again, it might be better, might be worse, but I think we shouldn't just dismiss the idea that parents are in a pretty good position to make choices for
They
their
actually
kids.
have a constitutional right to do so.
Indeed.
And when you look at parent surveys, you get disappointed about how much information parents actually do have. I saw one of a magnet school program where most of the parents who had their kids in magnet school didn't know what it was a magnet for example.
The current state of knowledge is absolutely desperate, no question about it.
So we've got two people with microphones. They're going to both ask very quick questions, and then we'll ask the panelists to respond in a summary way to those questions and to anything else they want to say as their last word.
I'm Pedro Medina. Martha, you spoke about the for-profit and non-profit. There seems to be a trend in higher education for-profit with over 700 institutions already in this country. What are some of the existing niches that you see in higher education where you see opportunities such as the garbage or the ADRs or some of the other things you mentioned? And this is to any of the panelists.
Okay, and we'll take the other question too.
Sure. I'm wondering if one of the core issues that's being avoided is the issue of accountability or perceived lack of accountability of public and private institutions to constituents. I think of inner city public schools, which are supposed to be the ultimate public institutions, being an example. And wondering if there are non-market privatization and accountability mechanisms, such as having maybe parental boards on schools or other such mechanisms.
Okay. Martha, anybody in the panel want to take on these two questions or say a last word?
I'm not an expert in higher ed. I can say that it's impressive to me that when it comes to foreign language instruction, the private institutions seem to be doing a better job than the public ones. And at the university level, college level, that may be the case. And also some technical skills, computers and other kinds of technical skills, specialized instruction. I think the exploration of a variety of accountability mechanisms is the challenge of our age. So whether it's using the consumer who can be motivated or revitalizing mechanisms of democracy, so community councils, new kinds of elections. We have technology that will allow everyone to vote immediately. Is that a good thing or not? Can we use the web for debates? I think that reinventing accountability is the challenge of this age. The worry that I have is that there's a passivity and there's a quiescence, so that people don't feel they can get involved and people don't know how to get involved, whatever mechanism that we're going to use, whether it's democracy or markets or administration, any of these mechanisms of accountability. So I have a story, and the story is that there was a young man who wanted to challenge the wise man in the town. And he said to himself, I'm going to hold a bird in my hand, and I'm going to say to the wise man, is this bird alive or dead? And if the man says the bird is alive, I'm going to squeeze my hand and kill him. If the man says the bird is dead, I'm going to open up my hand and let the bird fly away. So the big day arrives, he has the whole town there, and he does this in front of the wise man, and the wise man says, the fate of that bird is in your hands.
Does anybody want to follow that? I'd like to thank you very much for a stimulating discussion.